here with us to give a talk about the American Powder Company, Powder Mills. Dave is a resident of Maynard and sort of an avid backseat historian himself. Has a fine collection of Maynard postcards, which I've been fortunate to gaze through and share. Dave's been tromping around in the woods for many years, looking at the remains of the buildings that still exist out in the woods down along Powder Mill Road. So, without further ado, Dave Pierson.
Thank you, Peg. Everybody, thank you for being here. I won't say who I am, since somebody already did. I will say one thing. It occurred to me after I made this slide up. I've never heard a ghost story about the powder mills. That's sort of a symbolic ghost, a literary ghost, rather than a literal ghost story ghost. I'll start with thanking Peg and Paul Boothroyd and everybody for inviting me. See if I can figure out how to make this work. The other more important thing, perhaps anytime anybody's doing history, you end up dependent on a lot of people who have been there before you. I'll mention Brewster Conant of Acton, who has put together a small pamphlet, much more detailed than anything I'm going to get into tonight, which I found after I'd done some digging around in, amongst other places, the Acton Library, where I believe he'd left the clippings that I found and reused. The next name, Dr. Witten, lives in Gorham, Maine, and curiously enough, Gorham, Maine had a powder mill. And Dr. Witten set out to write a history and ended up writing a history of all the powder mills in the state of Maine. And that linked back, fortunately for us here in Maynard, to the powder mills in Acton, Maynard. The last name is Jane Austen, spelt correctly. She lived in Concord around 1870 in Boston, as opposed to Jane Austen of England. And Jane Austen wrote, fortunately for us again, about a 20-page piece in the Atlantic Monthly in 1870 on a visit to the American powder mills. So there's a lot of interesting information there. The last reference, which probably nobody will remember, but I put it on there anyway to add a line. The important part to remember is the UNH.edu. We'll get to why in a minute. At UNH, which is the University of New Hampshire, they have online topographical survey maps of all of New England and New York, basically 3 editions, 3 printings, 1890, 1920-ish, and 1950-ish. So for people doing digging around in historical and with usual web tools, there's a lot of information out there. How did I get involved in this? Well, I moved up here some years ago. These whiskers date to the Maynard Centennial, for those of you who remember the Maynard Centennial. Someplace I have movies. And I lived up originally on the Concord-Maynard line, and I started riding my bicycle. I set out to ride all the streets and all the towns surrounding, and a few streets that weren't on the maps, including I discovered some wood roads that went back into the woods, various places. And once I got in there, I started finding strange structures, not exactly houses, not exactly buildings, and I'd already heard of the mills, so I said, these must be the leftovers of the powder mills. Someday I shall have to find out more about them. And of course I didn't. And some time went by, and I got involved on, let's call it a semi-professional basis, as a trained assistant at public display fireworks shows, such as Maynard has, though I've never worked a Maynard one. And fireworks, display fireworks especially, use a lot of black powder. And I said to myself, Self, you really should get back into those woods sometime and see if you can find any of those old mill remnants and find out some more about them. And of course I didn't. So one day I got an email as I was between jobs from the implosion of a well-known computer company. And I got an email from a friend of mine. He said, Dave, have you ever heard of American powder mills? Do you know about the archives of maps on UNH? And I said, well, that's about several questions in there. And the answer is, yes, I know about American powder mills. Yes, I know about that archive. In fact, it was partially set up by a gentleman who used to work for a well-known computer company. And no, I don't recognize a specific sheet. I'd never actually looked at the Maynard sheet for 1890. Now, I don't know how many people can read this. I guess I could have popped it up a little bigger. But here's Maynard, as it was by 1890. And lo and behold, here's this big block of property, I don't know how accurate it is, labeled American Powder Company. I'll stop here for a moment and say there were a variety of names associated with this operation. American Powder Mills, American Powder Company. Originally, I believe it was Burke's Mills from a Mr. or Colonel Burke of Sudbury who was involved in the founding. West Vale, or if you prefer, West Concord. The railroad out to Acton, Fitchburg, and the Hoosac Tunnel over there on the wall someplace. So I talked to my friend and we got together and I took a walk in the woods and then we took a walk in the woods. And then I mentioned it to Peggy Brown and lo and behold, here we are. In fact, having mentioned that walk in the woods, I don't know if that's a ghost. The one on the left is not a ghost. These are walkable too fairly readily. It is private property. If you choose to take a walk, be respectful. If you choose to take a walk, stay away from those buildings. Those are big timbers. They've lasted 150 years. Well, don't know exactly how old that building is. I didn't see a date. But it's probably not real structurally sound to get too near those timbers. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've seen some degradation over the couple of times I've been out there. So, every caution if somebody chooses to go for a walk in the woods. Okay, I've used the word powder mills, which is the way they were referred to at the time. It was recognized that if you said powder mills, you meant gunpowder mills, or black powder mills, or blasting powder mills, all of which refers to more or less the same thing. We're going to talk about this. It's a bit of an explosive. For anybody who wants real details, any encyclopedia, these days, of course, a web search will turn up lots and lots of details. I'll get into some more later on. It is highly flammable. It is moderately explosive. I don't recommend anybody working with it without adult supervision. Perhaps most commonly known as gunpowder, which can be a little confusing because it isn't used in guns anymore, except for recreation, reenactment groups, Civil War groups, the Concord Minutemen, the Concord Independent Battery. As I said, I lived in Concord but was not associated with the battery. There are people who build and buy replicas that fire just antiques. People get into antiques, old ways of doing things. I've been called an antique, but not recently. So it can be a little confusing to refer to it as gunpowder. I use that sense in the sense of black powder. What is in guns these days is almost always what's called smokeless powder, which was invented around 1870 in Europe. And we'll come to that. It comes into our story after a bit. It's a lot easier to take care of weapons that are using smokeless powder. It doesn't leave behind as much residue. If you have to use it, it doesn't leave a lot of smoke in front of you so people can see where you are in case there's something unpleasant going on. So, black powder, what I will say properly so called, I'll try to stick to black powder, generally agreed to have originated in China roughly 1,000 years ago. It's not clear exactly how it was discovered. There may be a hint in one of the Chinese phrases for it, which is fire drug, which is to say a pharmacist of 1,000 years ago was looking for something, an elixir of life, an elixir to transform something into gold, and oh, that was fairly vigorous and interesting, as something went poof in his reaction. So they worked at that a little bit. They invented what amounts to a prototype firecracker. They used it on incendiary incendiary arrows, which led to incendiary rockets, which they did use in some combat work, notably against cavalry, because horses don't like it very much. After a bit, the knowledge traveled westward along the trade routes. There's a certain amount of debate. In fact, as with a lot of history, there's lots of debate about lots of aspects of black powder history. You read enough books, you will find several opinions. So keep reading and guess. Anyway, the knowledge arrived in Europe. Europe seems to have been the place where it became functionally gunpowder. People put it in a tube, closed at one end, put something on top of it, and sent the something the other way, usually for combat purposes. By 1700s, it was more or less universal in Europe. It was a necessary part of being a nation state to have a supply of gunpowder. You ran into some problems with some of the ingredients, notably the saltpeter, otherwise known as potassium nitrate nowadays. The one source was human and animal quote-unquote waste, to the point where there was a king's, now I've gone and lost the name, a king's commissioners who had permission to go around and search your stables and privies for useful chemistry. We've progressed since then with other sources of supply. From Europe, of course, it arrived in the New World. As early as 1635-ish, there is a grant from the Massachusetts legislative body, the exact proper name of which escapes me again, to a Reverend Rawson in Newbury of 200 acres of land at Pequot for powder mills, if the peter come, which is to say saltpeter, which they needed to make it. Now, one of the mysteries here is nobody seems to be exactly sure where Pequot is or was. The assumption is it was up around Newbury, but I haven't run that down yet. It's interesting that Dr. Rawson was a local minister. He was also local civic leader. He was an educated man, so he got handed the job of, let's see if we can make some gunpowder. Turns out they didn't get any peter for another 50 years. The details are not documented. I suspect it had to do with being a colony. Part of being a colony is they wanted to sell you things, like gunpowder, as opposed to sell you ingredients, like saltpeter. Also, of course, if you let them have too much gunpowder, you never know what they're going to get up to. Which sort of leads us up to 1770-ish, 1775. It's a few days after Patriots' Day, isn't it? Well, some months before Patriots' Day, some people argue that the Revolutionary War really started in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where a bunch of local gentlemen, or thugs, depending on who's writing the history book, held up the King's Fort at Newcastle, actually Newcastle, New Hampshire, rather than Portsmouth, and stole all the military supplies that weren't glued down. I'm told that later in the Revolutionary War, those supplies, including the gunpowder, traveled through Maynard on their way to Washington's forces further south. Now that brings us up to 1800, 1810-ish. We were the United States. There were some number of powder mills even before the Revolutionary War, because at that point there was no way of stopping it anymore. Early part of the 1800s, probably the first powder mills in Massachusetts were in Southwick. By 1837, Colonel Pratt, or Mr. Pratt, I think I've seen Colonel someplace, from Sudbury. And according to some records with what we now call technicians, borrowed hemp from the Southwick crew, started building a dam and powder mills along the Assabet This will look a lot like the other sheet. See if I can get myself oriented. The dam is more or less here. This is a later sheet. This is from the 1950, sorry, topographical map. This is not conveniently located marked American powder mills. There is, as I discovered, a whole meshwork of roads built over the years back through this area, some of which Knox Trail is one in Acton that leads back into what is now an industrial park. Now, one thing which is sort of the reason I included this, the powder mills extended, or the powder mill enterprise, it was a mile or so along the Assabet from more or less back this way to at least down to here, and I have not seen a good tight map that shows exactly where. There's a lot of room for future research in this area, assessor's maps, what have you. Mr. Conant did some of this. As I say, there's room for a lot more. And there's some discontinuities in terms of, did the mills extend back into here or didn't they? Where exactly? But, and I cut this a little fine, Acton, what was then Sudbury, more of Sudbury, Concord. So we have the mills, by a strange coincidence, located as far from the center of the towns involved as possible. I mentioned the Gorham Mills in Maine. The same thing can be seen there. It's on the line between Gorham and the next town north. Other mills were located closer to downtown with not very good results. Powder mills are one of those enterprises that has a tendency to promptly disassemble, as they say in some circles. There were, in any mills, a number of explosions with varying numbers of fatalities. We'll come back to that a little later. I have not done an exact count for the Acton mills. So we have a location far from the center of everything, by coincidence far from the center of Maynard, which didn't exist yet since this was 1830-something-ish. You had a location which was not that far, and here I'm speculating a little as to the link from the railroad, which goes out to Acton and into Boston, and on, as I say, to the Hoosac Tunnel. We have a location with a river with water power where a dam could be and was built. The other thing we have is we have these loops, and what doesn't show in too much detail here but is true, there are glacial cut curves in these high walls. You can see this high profile. So that something located down by the riverbank, if anything unpleasant happened, it could be isolated to that one local area. Because what developed was down in here, warehouses, worker housing, stables, some manufacturing plant along here. The actual mills proper were in here and possibly back in here. This is unclear. As I say, there's a meshwork of roads. There are some isolated remnants of foundations. Whether those are powder mill or not, that's up for future work. Having mentioned the dam a couple of times, this is an old postcard we have in the Maynard collection. A similar shot from another angle. This is from perhaps an unusual angle in that this is from the, what I'll call the north and probably get it wrong, side of the river, across towards what is now, I believe, Swanson, Pontiac. This building was taken down this past summer after the washout they had up by the dam. Water power. In 1837-ish, that was how you got mechanical work done. Or you used a horsepower with horses walking in circles. But if you're going to be dealing in large quantities of something, water power in New England made a lot of sense. Elsewhere in the world, you would find water power, the occasional steam engine. It could be done, but it was a little tricky. Black powder and steam engine and furnace exhaust do not get on. There was also the use in England of windmills. One thinks of windmills in terms of pumping, in terms of various agricultural grinding. Windmills, in fact, before water power became widespread, were used for anything we'd use mechanical power for today. Somebody's celebrating. So, I've talked about some of the reasons for where they were and why they were. One I didn't mention because it's not really specific to that site is wood. Because I've mentioned saltpeter, another ingredient is charcoal. You can get wood anywhere in New England, so you can have a powder mills anywhere in New England. But there was plentiful supply of wood. The process yields the best powder with certain specific woods: maple, grape, a few others have been found to be desirable. It comes down to the microstructure. It's quote-unquote all carbon, but you get various amounts of microstructure underneath. It's a matter which people will still argue about. I've mentioned New England. At that time, more or less, there was the Southwick Mills. There was a mills in Barry, which at one point was owned by the American Powder Mills Organization. And in fact, some of the Barry equipment was shipped to the Acton site when they closed the Barry plant. There was a mills in East Lowell / Chelmsford. I think I've got that right, East Lowell anyway. But I guess the Lowell folks decided that they were better off doing fabric and the things that they did there than powder mills. It was better to leave that to the folks up in the wilds of Maine in Acton. There was one in the western part of the state, at least one north of North Adams. This may have been a dedicated plant to supply blasting powder for the Hoosac Tunnel. Not clear. The Hoosac Tunnel used a couple of different blasting systems. They were using a lot of powder. They were at it for 15 years. So that may well have been why that plant was out there. And this is another thing I neglected to mention earlier in the subject of gunpowder is most of the production, in fact, was used not in guns as such, but for agricultural, mining blasting, construction blasting, railroad tunneling, railroad cutting. Anyway, back to the mills. The reference is almost always to powder mills. Now, if we look across the street, we have a woolen mills with lots of buildings, all next to each other, so you can move stuff from the carding shop to the bleaching shop to the spinning shop to the weaving shop, and I'm probably getting those out of order. Powder production, black powder production, also involved a number of steps. But as I mentioned to earlier with regards to the site, you don't want those steps too close together, because if something goes wrong at one of them, you just as soon not lose the whole plant. And depending on what goes wrong, you'll lose part of the building, you'll lose all of the building. With any luck, most of the equipment will survive. Some of the equipment, even in the 1830s, did not run with people in attendance, so it was quite possible to have a prompt disassembly without necessarily having anybody injured. People were injured, people were killed. One thing that comes up when I started going through this last time that had never struck me before. If we think about where this is located, next to Concord. Back in high school, I studied, well, I tried not to study, Thoreau's Walden. Frankly, I didn't find it particularly interesting, except for the part where he talked about the railroad that ran by his cabin. Well, as I got into this, I realized, wait a minute. While Walden was living in his cabin, Thoreau was living in his cabin at Walden, they're making gunpowder 4 miles away through the woods. The odd connections of history. I have a strange sense of connections. Okay. I mentioned Jane Austen. In 1870, she wrote an extensive series of articles, an extensive article, 20-odd pages, which, fortunately, somebody scanned and posted to the web. I have, the Maynard Historical Society now has a copy of. I actually went and bought a copy, bound copy of that issue of Atlantic Monthly, though I never actually read the paper copy.
Do you remember what month it was?
I believe it was November 1870. There is an index, and Library of Congress, I think, has an index that is searchable. And the exact title is Highly Explosive, in which a slightly fictionalized young lady starts out to collect flowers in the woods, becomes more or less lost, and ends up being given a tour by the, quote, treasurer, end quote, of the powder mills. Doing some other research, I discovered recently that treasurer in this case is one of those words that will fool the researcher. Apparently, up until about 1900, the head of a New England corporation was not uncommonly called the treasurer, as opposed to the president or the chief executive. Just one of those strange little linguistic tricks that will catch you. One thing, while I've got this up, which I confirmed over here, which we'll come back to again later. If you're at all familiar with the way the water power for the mill works, or worked, there's a dam, the river flows past the dam and through the center of town, but the dam drives a divergence canal, what might be called a raceway, that comes over to the mill pond proper. This dam, while it now, and for some years had a hydroelectric generator on it, also drove what I'll call a canal, and what might have been called a raceway, which went under the road, back into the woods, and looped around that curve in the river to drive the powder mills. Or at least the mills part of the powder mills. I think I'll skip over here. I've talked about milling. Black powder is a fairly simple composition, 3 ingredients: charcoal, we know what charcoal is, sulfur, I believe that's got agricultural uses in the garden. The sulfur at the time would have come from the Mediterranean, from volcanic deposits by sea. The saltpeter at the time for these mills would probably have come from India, where it exists in surface deposits and was shipped worldwide. The mills, at a somewhat later time, were turning out 750,000 pounds of black powder a year with a possibility of do more. That's a lot of materials. Hence, it's handy to be next to the rail line, though the rail line didn't come through until a few years after the mills were located. And it's nice to be able to ship it out. And what I didn't point out on that slide is there was a spur, I remember at the rail spur, that went from the main line right down into what is now the industrial park and what at the time I believe was the shipping operation of the powder mills. That way you didn't have to use horsepower to haul the stuff through the center of Maynard, through the center of Acton, whatever. Charcoal was made on site in kilns. It was a fairly standard process for all the things one might use charcoal for, including steel making. New England had a steel industry at the time. Where I grew up in Connecticut, there was an iron mine up until the Revolutionary Wars. The hole in the ground is still there, though I believe they bulldozed it to keep people out. Sulfur, again, generally came in pretty good state. The sulfur and the charcoal could be ground together. The saltpeter would typically require some refinement. This was done basically by dissolving it in hot water, steam heated kettles. That way the fire was over there and your process line was over here, and cuts down on the accidents. Anything that didn't dissolve, you didn't want in your process, so somebody would skim it off the top. Then you would crystallize it out, and the first stuff that crystallized out was pretty good saltpeter as it evaporated away. You'd harvest these. They'd go off to a crushing operation to bring them up to a powder. These three ingredients would then weighed and taken to the first step where things get really risky. It may seem a little odd, but the way you make the black powder is you pour all your ingredients in and you crush them. You can crush them by hand with a mortar and pestle, or the way it was done here is what's called a wheel mill. Imagine, think of that building we were looking at, which may well have been a wheel mill. Imagine a 10-foot diameter steel track, iron track as the case may be, a couple of 8-foot diameter wheels on edge above that going round and round and round, driven by your water power. You had enough of what was called the charge in there that the steel wheel never got down to the steel bed. And that was one way to get into trouble, is if somebody wasn't watching what was going on, it got too fine, too much of the powder floated away, and the steel wheel got in touch with the steel bed, and then you got to rebuild it all. Once you had ground, and the operative word here is once, because up to 24 hours was typical for the grinding process. They had at least 2 mills where the grinding was taking place. Oh, the crew would come in, and there were safety rules. I'll touch on some more of. I'll mention one here. Wooden rakes, wooden shovels, no steel rakes, no steel shovels, please. Any powder mills had a set of rules. There's one in the collection here that is actually from the Oriental Mills, which is the one in Gorham, Maine. But there were similar rules everywhere. And dig out 100 pounds of powder into one or more wooden wheelbarrows, which would be wheeled out of the mill to a wooden walkway that was provided to the next step in the process. At which point it was pressed by a hydraulic press, typically powered by water power. Screw presses are okay, but you've got rubbing metal parts. The hydraulic press has less rubbing metal parts, and rubbing metal parts are a bad thing. They have to be kept scrupulously clean. The powder was pressed to consolidate it, to get a uniform product. It was then run through another milling phase between toothed wheels, like gears, but not quite in mesh, that would break it up into chunks of varying sizes. Varying sizes is important. If you're selling blasting powder for mining, for construction, for road work, you want relatively large chunks, pea size, roughly. If you're going into big cannons, doesn't go into cannons anymore except for reenactors' cannons, you want a smaller grain size. If you're going into shotguns and rifles, smaller yet. Pistols, smaller yet. And if you're going really old and using a flintlock, that pop flash where the cock comes down needs a very, very fine powder. There's a whole set of technical names that date back to who knows when, involving series of Fs. F, 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 F. Didn't write them down, not going to bore you with them. I don't think anybody here is going to run out and buy black powder for their cannon. So, from this phase in the process, you would get a range of powder sizes. You could juggle the spacing. You want more fine powder? We give you more fine powder. You want bigger chunks because you've got a big order for blasting powder? Fine, we'll give you big chunks for blasting. After that, the powder chunks was screened to get the sizing I mentioned through various size screens. It would then, and this was a relatively late development in the 1700s, the potassium nitrate, the saltpeter if you will, was especially sensitive to picking up moisture, making the powder a little unpredictable. This was especially unpleasant if you were shipping it from England to the US or from England to India, and one of the kegs got knocked and things got damp, and oh boy, there's a bunch of powder we can't use. It was found that by glazing the powder of whatever size, after it had been sized, by tumbling it with charcoal. That sealed the surface, and you got a powder that lasted much better. All of this took place, pardon me while I shuffle pages here, in various structures along the acid bed. The packing took place, I believe, over off Knox Trail. There was some process that took place in this building in terms of packing. At this point, I've more or less drifted my way up to 1900. To understand what's going on, we'll back down to 1870, at which some folks in Europe were inventing what came to be called smokeless powder, which, or one of its modern variants, is used today. This is a whole different chemistry, which I'm not expert in and I'm not going into. Basically, the powder mills had to start doing some smokeless because that's what the customers were buying. There were some explosions getting that process online. Once that process is online, it's generally a safer process once it's running consistently. Black powder mills, no matter how carefully managed, do seem to have a tendency to get into trouble every few years. If you look at the Gorham mills, that's what happens. If you look at the Acton, the American powder mills in Acton and Maynard, that's what happened. Lost the train of it. Tilt. The smokeless powder, in general, once you've got it going, is less likely to go up. The most recent black powder mill explosion I happened to hear about was last summer, the last mill in the United States, which is now in Louisiana, had an explosion. It's all remote controlled nowadays. It's more just a matter of, uh-oh, what was that sudden loud noise? Count heads. Okay, shut everything down remotely, go out and clean it up. As I say, the black powder is still used for certain blasting operations. For certain kinds of mineral mining, it has advantages in terms of what it does to the rock. It basically doesn't break it up into little pieces, it breaks it up into big pieces. As the American powder mills started doing smokeless, they got good enough at it. During the First World War, it's recorded that the entire output of the mills went to Russia. Well, I don't think the Russians by that time were using black powder, so I'll assume this meant the entire smokeless powder output. Either as raw powder to be put into cartridges, because by that time people were putting their propellant into cartridges rather than ram it down one shot at a time. My understanding is this building was used for packing product for Russia. That's not casting concrete, but it's indicative. A couple of other random steps in the process. One I didn't mention, which I'm reminded of by the pictures over here. You're making a product. Things can go wrong. It's a good idea to check what you're doing every so often. So you'll find over here a picture of some guns that were kept at the powder mills, and somebody would go out once a day or once a week or when they got a new batch of ingredients in and test fire. And if you've got a careful marksman under controlled conditions, where the ball goes can tells you, where the bullet goes can tells you, okay, this lot of powder is good, this lot of powder is have a problem, we better check. It was a technical process. There were experts imported from England, which had a few to spare, I guess. Just as American railroads learned from the English, we imported some English powder technicians. I mentioned horsepower. The mills had an extensive stables, both for hauling random wagons. As I say, it was quite a mesh of roads that went with this operation, some of which still exist back in those woods, and remarkably well made. Well, you were hauling heavy cargoes, let alone the fact that they were things that didn't like to be bounced around too much. They also had a railroad. It's not clear whether the gauge was narrow or standard. I suspect it was one of the narrow gauges, with lots of 1 horsepower hay-eating locomotives. By that time, of course, you could get steam locomotives in any size you wanted, but again, steam locomotives and a black powder works don't go together real well. There are a number of things that don't go together. Maybe it's time to mention some of those safety rules. My shoes are no good. They put them back together with steel screws the last time, so you weren't allowed steel nails in your shoes. You had special shoes, special boots made with wooden pegs to avoid striking a spark. In a day when it wasn't necessarily common, there was a bathhouse, a wash house, locker room for the employees, because the powder making clothes stayed on site, and he went home in his own clothes. Which may be a point to mention home, because out there along the river there was, at that time even, company houses, a powder mill village. So they didn't want their boarding house blown up by their employees wearing their powder mill clothes home. Other safety rules, no smoking obviously. The inside of the mills was lit by lanterns on the outside through a glass window. Specialized tools only to be used, typically wood. There's also non-sparking metal tools, bronze. For such an operation today, you might also use aluminum where it was possible, but at that point it might have been bronze. There were restrictions on who could fix what and who had to approve what after it had been fixed. You didn't want anybody going in there and monkeying with the machinery, because if something got misadjusted, something might get pinched. And then, well, sorry boss, mill number 1 will be offline for a couple of weeks. It's in several pieces. Let's see what else we've got in here. I didn't index the rest of these. Okay, this is identified as the powder mill office, greetings from Maynard, Mass. An almost identical picture with a horse-drawn cart is over here in the Historical Society. This is a postcard of no known date. Somebody might be able to guess whose gas buggy that is. That building exists out next to Maynard Supply, I believe. It's been refaced a couple of times. It doesn't look quite like that anymore. Who the gentleman and who the, I believe, lady would be interested to know, but it doesn't say. All right, we're now back in the woods. This appears to be where the water would have come out of the canal/tunnel to wind along the bank of the river. I should have put another copy of those map slides in here. Oh well. This is an open part with the last view behind, to my left, your right, across the side of the hill. You're looking more or less due east. I can tell by the shadows on the trees because I know when I took the pictures. You can see the snow out there. It wasn't that long ago. This shows a spillway, a concrete spillway structure. It would have been part of the water control gear. Oops, wrong button. This, it's, as you can see, these are kind of over, you look at trees like that and then you think, well, those are, what, 40, 50-year-old trees. So you're taking pictures, you can, again, you can see the snow, you can see pockets back in here where structures of various sorts once stood for purposes now lost. Having said that, there's another set of maps known to historical researchers as the Sanborn insurance maps, which existed for many industries. I've seen copies of the ones for the mill. It costs non-zero amounts of money to get access to them, so I haven't. But they may identify some of these structures if I ever... have no idea what that is. It's probably fairly recent. by which I mean to say 1930, 1920. It's a fireproof storehouse for something out there in the woods, or what is now woods. This is perhaps 20, 40 feet from the river and about 10 feet above what at that point was near flood stage. As I said, roads through the woods, well-made roads, solid roads. Some of these trees are older, may well have been there while the mills were operating. Oh dear, I've left one out. This is back in the industrial park along Knox Trail Road. A lot of the buildings in there are clearly modern. This building, metal sheathed, metal sheathed door, secured. Looks to me like a powder structure, a fireproof structure for storing powder, ammunition, waiting for shipment. This building is of an equal age, and if you go down along here, the rail siding is still there. It's been cut away from the railroad because they don't use it anymore, but the rails are still there. Materials would have come in and out. I think, I have an awful feeling, yeah, I left out. Okay, this is one I took a couple of days ago, and general layout, this is the office buildings. The end door is gone, the windows have been replaced, and I believe it's now part of the color store, I think is the name. My apologies to them if I get it wrong. And there's that one for comparison. Can I back this up anyway? Thank you. I am not a PowerPoint expert. You will have noticed that. Come on, where'd they put backspace on this cockamamie thing? All right. I will back. Okay. This is the one I was sort of looking for earlier. This is along that same road, shot the same day. As you can see, the structure is starting to go. Concrete foundation. There would have been a horizontal water wheel / hydraulic turbine in there. The sides were light, so they'd blow out. So you wouldn't have a lot of money tied up in materials that might blow out. The structure was heavy, so that probably it would survive, and as you can see, it survived 60 years. After World War I, things started to wind down. Even before that, there had been consolidation in the black powder industry, transition from black powder to other blasting agents. A lot of the manufacture had moved west, where the transportation expenses weren't so high and where the product was going to be used anyway. In the early part of the 1800s, for instance, the Maine mills, we know, shipped product for export through Portland. There was a canal that was built for general traffic that ran by the plant. We don't have specific records as to whether the American powder mills exported or not, other than the one mention of the Russian order. The assumption is they probably did. I mentioned 750,000 pounds per year, maybe a bit more if they needed to. That is, by some rough calculations based on some number in Professor Witten's book, Dr. Witten's book, 4 to 6% of the U.S. production. It's not a lot, but it was in the top 6 of the overall United States plants, let's say. The big one, DuPont Company, DuPont used to be DuPont Powder Mills, now they're on to other things. They have a museum outside outside Wilmington, Delaware, with extensive general industrial history collection and restored parts of their original mill, which was started in the 1800s. They have some resource materials online as well. I didn't pull all these references together. One can find them easily enough and probably more accurate, since sometimes they change them. With the general switch to other sorts of explosives, this local operation sort of ran down and seems to have wound up by 1940. Other plants, new plants optimized for current military and other explosives and blasting agents were going up elsewhere in the country, more modern, lower cost. The property passed at some point, as I say, it went through a number of names. The property passed at some point to, I'll make a small correction here, it's American cyanamide rather than American cyanide. The cyan part comes from the fact that they originally got in the business of making a blue or cyan dye and then got into other chemical things. The other thing is, by 1900, the whole process was becoming more chemistry driven, more chemist driven, rather than the old, a shovelful of this, a shovelful of that, carefully weighed shovelfuls, but just throw together 3 dry ingredients and mill for an hour, which argued for larger corporations, and they happened to set up shop elsewhere. At which point, having taken ourselves through a walk through the woods and having seen, if not any ghosts, some haunted houses, I guess I'll take questions. I would have taken them at any time if anybody had asked. And I will also say there is a great deal more that could be found out, that might be dug up. If anybody here has any stories, knows any stories, please capture them somehow. Get them to the Historical Society. I'll also, and I won't back all the way up, like to thank again the sources that I used. Brewster Conant from Acton. Didn't ask his, just got his pamphlet and read it after I'd done most of the research, but anyway. He was there first. Dr. Whitten, whose book I have, if anybody really wants to read about the mills of Maine, and extracts, and of course, Ms. Austin, who provided a lot of detail, a lot of, I'll use an old world, slice of life detail in terms of the horsepower, the changing rooms, what have you. So, any questions?
You just started to talk about a second ago about ownership of property, chain of ownership. Where is it now? What happened to it?
I honestly don't know. It's in various hands depending on which segment it is.
C.D. Fletcher bought all that land, and then he sold it to Glenn Swift and Dan Hayes. Got all the property, all the way to 117, you know.
Okay.
You had mentioned about working in those plants. They had to work up a soul through it. And some of the wagons, when they blew up, all they ever found was the honey.
That was a question I was going to wonder about, whether the horses were actually shod, and you're saying they are. Or whether they'd work the horses without shoes just for that reason.
You know, they had shoes. They'd find some shoes after
Okay.
they hauled them powder or whatever they were, you know. All up.
So one thing I didn't mention a second time, there were a number of explosions over the years of varying sizes. I'll say roughly 10. I didn't actually count them. That's another point. I'm told there is a, I'll use the word group grave over in the Maynard cemeteries, which I've not found yet, which basically says, these are the guys who died in the powder mill explosion of such and such date. And I'm told that if we can identify names, there is actually a government money available for putting up an explicit grave marker. So that's presumably a matter of finding the right set of old newspapers and digging around.
I believe Dr. Hooper's father was in charge of the houses down there. Yeah, we have a picture of him over here.
And yes, there are various pictures you can look at over here on the table.
They also have a big eagle over the wall, too.
Okay. Well, by that time it was American cyanamide, and depending on which set of histories you read, they wind it down either just before or just after World War II in terms of being the American powder mill's history.
Doc Hooper told me that when his dad got his leg blown off in the explosion, that he had a brand new car. And he couldn't get to the main gate. He put it right through an auxiliary gate, destroyed the car practically, and found his dad. It was winter, snow, so that helped save his life. But one of the other co-workers came up, saw Doc's father laying there and leg gone, dropped dead of a heart attack. And Doc's father was trying to revive him with snow in his face. Yeah,
When emergencies happen, they sometimes come together.
right.
All right, let me glance through here in case I've missed anything. But I don't seem to find anything. Anyway, I hope this has been of some interest.
One quick question. Seems like in today's standards, that black powder, was that expensive to purchase? You know, I mean, it's hard to compare with today's prices, but I'm just curious, economy-wise, what they...
I don't have, it was not expensive in terms of being a luxury item. It was a necessity in many places. It was a commodity. They were making 750,000 pounds a year here, and that's 10% of the production. It was driven to some extent by ingredients prices. Yeah, they had to haul them in, they had to ship the ingredients in cross ocean, but they needed the product. One thing I mentioned, we know a lot of our, the U.S. current use of sulfur, I know, comes from what amount to wells. They inject steam and get it back as molten sulfur down in Texas and like that. Another brief item that slipped out was President's Day not so long ago, and somebody wrote an article. It was in one of the local papers, or one of the Boston papers rather. And I think whoever wrote it thought he was being very funny about such and such a president, and I'm forgetting which one. And his main achievement in office was that he'd made an agreement with South America over the import of bird droppings. Well, of course, I'm sure the reporter thought that was very funny. But if you look a little further, you discover that the bird droppings, otherwise known by the good Inca word guano, are an important agricultural fertilizer. And oh, by the way, you can refine them for potassium nitrate to make your gunpowder. So maybe if Mr. Reporter had dug a little deeper and discovered that the president had worked on a treaty concerning agricultural and military imports, commercial imports, but that wouldn't have made such a good joke, now would it?
Even in the play 1776, John Adams writes home to Abigail that he wants the women to organize and make saltpeter and send it to them, because they can do the rest of the black powder, but they need saltpeter. So the women were able to...
Well, it's a matter of collecting waste, boiling it out a couple of times, and it's not pretty, but if you got to do it, you got to do it.
And then we got our pins, yes.
My father lost 3 fingers in an explosion.
What year was that, do you recall?
That's very details I have. I talked to a fellow this morning. I discussed my father's, and he told me that his father lost 2 fingers and they were able to restore him back into his hand.
Well, that's good work for the time.
But the black powder, though, it explodes a little different from smokeless powder.
Yeah.
Black powder was, you know, like in the barrels on sporting guns were made out of Damascus steel or twist steel barrels. The powder, black powder, will go out the barrel, but if you use smokeless powder, it would blow it apart. You know, it would blow sideways, you know.
Smokeless powder, volume for volume, is more powerful.
More powerful, right.
And at the time, if you looked at guns, they would be labeled for use with smokeless powder or for use with black powder only. And if you had an old gun, it was up to you to know, don't put the new powder in it because you're going to destroy it and probably hurt yourself. which is the problem with any technological changes. Somebody doesn't get the word. So, any other questions?
What did you call that, one name for saltpeter? How do you make it?
Potassium nitrate. As I say, there's no secret about any of this. My guess is you walk over to the library, I just recall if they're open tonight, pop open any encyclopedia and look up gunpowder. Or these days, of course, you can do it on the web. So it's all there with the proportions and what have you. Well, it's possible, I guess, to make your own, but I don't recommend it because it is kind of flammable. Not to mention the fact that there are a few federal and state laws about such exercises. In proper premises, expertly managed, it's doable, but in the basement, I wouldn't recommend it.
But the Sudbury Annex, there wasn't any crossover there that could occur between the powder mills and Sudbury Annex, or was it too far gone by that?
To the best of my knowledge, no, and the Sudbury Annex was used to store ammunition going out through the port of Boston, is my understanding. It's tempting to think about the two sets of sites so close together, but Sudbury Annex dealt with finished product, finished munitions on the way elsewhere. You can look at it and say it's sad that the mills shut down just as the start of the war. On the other hand, they were of a previous generation and there were more modern mills, arguably better equipped, better use of resources elsewhere.
You said initially too, it was a Colonel Pratt?
Pratt is correct. I think I saw Colonel someplace.
It's interesting, because isn't there a Pratt Mill Road in Sudbury?
Probably the same Pratt. Oh, that's one thing I did not mention. If you wander around, you will discover Powder Mill Road in Sudbury, Powder Mill Road in Concord, Powder Mill Road in Acton, Powder Mill Road in Maynard, all of which come together. Those would have shown up on some of the maps if I'd expanded them a little.
They had two mills right behind the, grinding mills right behind the, Swanson.
Yeah.
Smuggler station was. And, they had a culvert, a huge culvert that came out of the river, it went under 62.
That's the raceway I was describing.
And it went into those mills. And, of course, the river was always polluted. When I went to school, you know, it'd be red and meantime it would be blue. And, all coming down. And they never plugged that, and I bought the acre, the corner of Powder Mill Road and for that smuggler station. And, they never plugged up that culvert. And that polluted that entire ground. After we built that Sunoco station, we had to get an occupancy permit, and because of the pollution in the ground, we went down and got water out of there, and then that was in the town of Acton, but you couldn't get an occupancy permit because the water was polluted. We almost went to China, but then even after we got the water, it would eat out the latrines. That's how bad that is polluted. And now all the fuss and Acton about, you know, the pollution that they have there, a lot of that was caused by the American Powder Company. You know, that land was so polluted that we sold the place. You know, it's so contaminated, the ground there, you can't do anything with that ground.
Anybody else?
People might remember when we were talking about the Damon Mills last fall. In his records, he would say, today the powder mill blew, and such was hurt, and such was killed, you know, and then his wife would go out and try to do good work for it. So that blowing up of the mill affected West Concord as well as it did Maynard. You remember the time in the history books tell us all the windows in Maynard broke when there was a big explosion over there.
Well, that's, when I first came up here, I thought of the powder mills as Maynard, and then I realized, no, they're actually in Acton. Well, actually, no, some of them are actually, this is sort of a joint enterprise here. And it's occurred to me that the Concord papers might be another place to make a look. Oh, when I mentioned Thoreau, I glanced through and annotated journals, and he actually had an entry in there in the 1850s after he had left Walden Pond. Today the powder mills blew up. If they'd only spaced these things further apart, it wouldn't happen. Well, maybe, or maybe something else. But
You might have mentioned before, but I don't remember, this powder like powder mill in Maynard and Acton, Conant, were they the same company or were they separate?
they were all the same company with properties in each, in the various towns. And as I say, when they were founded, they were the powder mills of Sudbury and Acton and Concord, because Maynard hadn't been incorporated yet. It would be interesting to wonder how much of having the powder mills there provided a commercial base that helped the village of Assabet, but I wouldn't be qualified to speculate on that area. Because at that point you didn't commute much further than you could walk unless you were the treasurer and had a fine horse and cart to drive around town in.
Well, you'll have a chance to talk to him afterwards if you come up with questions. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, everybody.